Thank you. Fans are everywhere. And so, with no further ado, I'd like to move on to our keynote speaker. I did some Wikipedia research on today's speaker because I really felt that the bio that he gave us was a bit bare bones. But I'm just going to say that our speaker today, Corky Evans, is, and this is just my own personal opinion, and it's a non-ideological opinion, I want to add, is, as far as I'm concerned, the most interesting, the most provocative, and I think one of the most effective people that the folks of British Columbia have ever elected to the Legislative Assembly in Victoria. I wish he were still there, and I wish there were a lot more people like him. Like me, Corky wasn't born in Canada, so like me, he's even more rabidly Canadian than those of you who are lucky enough to have been born here. Unluckily for him, he did not come from the great state of Oregon, which of course many of you know is really simply a southern extension of British Columbia. And only through a trick of fickle fate did it end up in the United States rather than where it really belongs, which is here. No, Corky grew up, sad to say, in California. But I think that in the many years since 1969 when he moved here, he's more than made up for that. I forgive you, Corky. I think most of you know Corky's political record, so I'm not going to recap that. I'm going to hand the mic over to him so we can hear as much of him as possible. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Corky Evans.
There's a whole whack of people here that I've known for a really long time and some new folks, but for those of you I've already met, it's lovely to see you again. And for everybody else, I can't possibly live up to what they just said. Yesterday, I was building a shelter for turkeys, and I needed some tools, and I went up to the shed, and I got a rake in my left hand, and then I found a shovel, and I was holding the shovel in my right hand, and then I thought, damn, I can't find the rake. And I'm starting to curse the other people that work around there. What did they do with the tools? And then I found it there in my left hand. And it occurred to me that you really shouldn't invite somebody to be your keynote speaker who can't remember what's in their left hand 1 minute later. That's all that stuff about me being an effective something or other, that might have been when I actually had a memory. Anyway, I apologize for the degeneration of my intellectual capacities in recent time.
Thank you, Corky, and now we're going to move on to...
Why is thinking actually? Okay, so I should start with personal history. Well, I used to log, and I wanted to say that the mayor of this town, Greg Lay, he was one of my first employers. I was working on a fire about an hour north of here. It was a big fire. At butt times it was a crown fire. Greg put some of us on top of the mountain, which is, of course, where the fire is going. And we got an extra 50 cents an hour for that. That was cool. And we lived there for a week, including part of the time when the fire crowned and went over the top. Anyway, after a week, we said, there used to be, I don't know if there still is there still a Johnson's Landing Jamboree every year? No, not anymore. Anyway, there used to be a big hoedown and drunk and dance, and it was coming up, and we asked Greg, now you're mayor, could we go to the party after a week on this mountain? Because he's a lovely person, he said, I will park a crummy with the keys in it at the bottom of the mountain. And if you can get there after dark and nobody sees, you can take the truck. But it has to be back at 5 o'clock in the morning when the first helicopter flies. And I'm sorry to waste my important time doing this, but they had been shipping water up to us in 45-gallon drums, which previously were used as helicopter fuel. And we took the water out of the drums and put out the fire, you know, with piss cans. Anyway, we discovered that if you chopped the top off one of the 45-gallon drums, there was still enough airplane fuel floating on the top of the water that you could throw in a match, light the water, heat it up, and get in there and have a bath. But since we chopped the top off with fire axes, it was a little scary on your naked body, getting in through. Anyway, thank you, Greg Lay. We were young then. And when I was logging, I got elected at a very young age when I was ignorant of everything to be a regional district director, so I've shared your lives in municipal government. And then I got elected as an MLA, and then I did some other things. And at one point I worked for UDI in the nonprofit sector, so I did that part of your lives too. And now I grow potatoes and blueberries and garlic and squash and stuff. I was at the caribou events, which I think were the antecedent of this, the Caribou Action, something or other, in the 1990s. What was it called? Nobody. Anyway, there were community events in the Caribou like this, talking about how to evolve as a rural area, which were the first really philosophical groundings I had ever gotten to attend in conversations amongst people talking about how to make life work outside the growing mega city evolution. And then in about 2006, 2007, there was the first Rural Summit in Clearwater, is that right? And it was wonderful. It was an honest discussion about what are we going to do now. I remember the chief of that area. They had just closed a bunch of sawmills in the region and closed the ranger station. And people were moving out and schools were closing. And the chief got up and in his welcoming address said, I know this is really hard times for all of us, but it's kind of neat in this way. We, Native people, used to have a really hard time. We tended not to have jobs, and we tended not to know how to talk to the people that gave jobs, and it was kind of a disconnect. And it hasn't gotten any better, but now we're all disconnected. So we're in it together, and we can start a conversation about how to make it better. It was a lovely speech, and it kind of named the beginnings of the times we're living in to me. I want to start this talk, except for the rambling nonsense you just heard, I'd like to start with saying, there was a thing in the, what do you call the internet thing, that about this event that said that I was going to be funny. Actually, that was when there was going to be another guy here too, and he actually is funny. I'm not funny. My friend who is funny, he had some medical trouble, so you got me, and it would be less entertaining. But I thought I'd talk about what I learned in all those years in municipal, provincial government, being town minister and stuff. And I want to start by saying I am an unreconstructed fan of democracy. I know more than anybody in this room about what's wrong with it. Okay, I know as much as anybody. And heckling is okay. Good for you. That's a good start. But I think it's a wonderful thing. And always when you hear on the radio that there's some emerging country in Eastern Europe or Africa, people are risking their lives to go vote, I think, thank God there's some people who still see it as an empowerment and an honor. And I'm a fan, actually more than that, also kind of like a person with church. I'm kind of a believer in the idea of mandate. I think that you're supposed to get together with some people that think like you and figure out what you believe in. And then they call those things policies. And then when you go run for office, you're supposed to have a platform. You're supposed to say what you're going to do. And the beautiful thing about democracy is if you win, you get to go do it. And we live in a place where, here's the cool thing. I served 14 years in the provincial legislature with people of all parties, independents, Socreds, liberals, conservatives, New Democrats, managing $18 billion a year, or something like that. And I never saw anybody steal anything. How cool, how many people in the whole world could say that? I had a friend in the Forest Service who got fired for selling his son-in-law a used snowmobile without advertising. Because that's corruption. And we live in a place where we get to vote, and the people who are there, lots of whom annoy the heck out of me, don't steal. It's okay to annoy me. But you live in a place where they're not. And all that money is passing through their hands and they're not enriching themselves. I worked with a cabinet minister once who was actually born in India, and he said, you know, Corky, if I had this job in India, no one in my family would have to work again for 6 generations. That's how different your democracy is. But I want to move on from saying I'm this huge fan of this system to saying one of the things that I learned is that I think perhaps British Columbia in the present times is ungovernable. It's manageable, but not really governable. It's manageable on a colonial model, like running India from England or something. But it isn't governable in the way that you elect somebody and you have the right to assume that that somebody can speak, voice for you, understand you, and that your way of life will be appreciated by those who make decisions. It's a colonial system where we took government, once it was in Burnaby, I think once it was in New Westminster too, and then we moved it over to a rock 30 miles offshore, and the corporate people and stuff could fly over in helicopters, you know that? And or helijet, they call it, to get over there, to isolate the people who make decisions from us. But that's only nickel dime. I mean, it's a beautiful city, Victoria. In fact, it's over there. It's a bit problematic. It ought to be in Vanderhoof, which is actually the middle. But the reason it's really ungovernable is because we pretend that from that island, you can make a set of rules that apply to the most biodiverse, physical, and cultural landmass in North America. In fact, you know, there is more, before we came here, there was more plants and animals, variety, in British Columbia than in all the rest of Canada from the height of the Rockies to the Atlantic Ocean. More. Because there's deserts here, there's rainforest here, there's alpine here, there's the grasslands of the caribou here, there's the wetland valley bottom of the Fraser Valley. There's the Peace River ecosystem that is unlike any. There is more diversity here in what we do, who we are, what grows here, the climate, than the rest of Canada. And we try to govern it with one Forest Act, one set of environmental rules, one Ministry of Agriculture, which is now 2 people. But we pretend that the civil service can actually manage this landmass and your towns from somewhere else. Here's another reason it's ungovernable, and it has to do with us. I had an assistant, Travis Bodie, worked with me as ministerial assistant for nigh on a decade, and then when I lost my job, he was looking for work. He went to work for the Premier of Manitoba, and I saw him 2 years later, and I said, Travis, what's it like? How's it in Manitoba? This is a very powerful, dangerous, stressful job you got. Oh no, he said, it's wonderful. And how come it's wonderful? You mean it's better than working for me? Yeah, he said. Because in British Columbia, the citizens expect their government to take responsibility for how well they live. And in the prairies, citizens expect the government to give everybody the same chance, but how it turns out is their own responsibility. So we not only have a government that makes all the decisions as if it's all the same, but we, the citizens, then blame them for how we make out in that place. And then it's ungovernable because all of us in this room, in terms of that chalice, that mandate, that policy platform mandate thing, we don't show up. Because you can win government in British Columbia now, unlike when we started, without winning a single seat past Chilliwack. Not one. You don't have to win anything north of the Sunshine Coast. When I started in politics in the Kootenays was timberland. You could stand up at an all-candidates meeting and just talk about trees for half an hour, if that's what you wanted. The people clapped, if they agreed with you, they booed, whatever. You could do land, timberland, lakes, rivers, sometimes the Columbia River Treaty. It was all land-based stuff. Same with fisheries in Prince Rupert, eh? Same with grain in the Peace, same with the grassland, the rangeland, and the caribou. Same with orchards in the Okanagan. The land base was politics. And today, the land base doesn't show up. And I'm not saying this has nothing to do with what parties. I'm saying the media, the population movement, the size of the GBRD, the fact that we now get all of our media from the city, it means that the things that day to day make up our lives are no longer the subject of discourse out on the rock. Here's an example Uli will understand. A few years ago, I was still elected. Hope and Talbot went bankrupt. Hope and Talbot was the logging company in Castlegar, or the sawmill in Castlegar, and they had a TFL 23, and they went bankrupt, and they stuck the loggers for $6 million, and then they started selling off chunks of the tree farm license in Europe. Most of everything I just said used to be against the law. And I had been off doing other work for a while. I didn't know it was inside the law. Like, what had happened? And I represented those people. I logged for a living. I knew them by their first name. I didn't think it was legal for a corporation in another country to sell pieces of my country in Europe. You sign a piece of paper, you get a tree farm license. It means you're logging on the people's land and you make a contract with the people. One of the things about democracy you guys all got to keep in mind in British Columbia is that unlike anywhere else in the world, you own 94%, 96% of the landmass. That's unlike any other province in Canada. That's unlike any other country in the world that I know of. Europe built its civilization by selling off the land. Eastern Canada, the guy that runs the forest in New Brunswick lives in the Cayman Islands. British Columbia, you own the lakes, the rivers, the ore, the gas under the ground. You get to go fishing on the Fraser River. You don't have to pay the rich man who lives next door anything, unlike England. Democracy, politics in British Columbia is the people's wealth. And when Pope and Talbot decided to sell off chunks of it in Europe, I went to my party and said, I'm going to get up a question period and challenge the Minister of Forest on this issue. And they said, no, we're asking about schools in Surrey today. And the hospital in New Westminster tomorrow. And day after day after day after day, the politics which would shut down the legislature just 20 years ago couldn't even get discussed. I want to explain to you a little bit how question period works because you might be under the illusion that it still represents something that you care about. And the people I was asking permission from were my brothers and sisters. And they are good people. You would like having dinner in their house. But they couldn't say, yes, you can talk about logging in the Gus. Because question period is actually run by BC TV, not by elected people. CTV, BC TV, like the television stations have employees in Victoria who go to the MLAs in the morning and say to the ones that are in control of these things, we're going to talk about blank tonight at 6 o'clock. And if you want any part of it, that's what you'll talk about in the question period of the day. And because the voters live where the television station communicates, and those voters make up the polls, and the polls drive the outcome of the election, and the minds of the people deciding Pope and Talbot in the cusp doesn't make any difference. And that's true of salmon in Prince Rupert, and that's true of the rangeland in the Caribou. The democracy that I believe, the church that I spent my life in, has got some holes in it. I guess my reflection would be that I think now the urban-rural split in politics in British Columbia is greater than the left and right. And the economy's changed too, obviously. You guys remember Bill Bennett Jr.? He went over to Japan and he made a speech and he said, yeah, you can buy our lumber. We would love to sell you lumber. We'll flood you with lumber, but you cannot buy our logging companies. Because the logging companies have tenure on British Columbia land, and that's our land, and it'll be our people. He went another step farther, Bill Bennett Jr. Remember, it's not very long ago, I ran against the guy. And now, I'd make him the godchildren, father of my children. If I was like, he went to Ontario and told, what's the mining company's name? Noranda. He told Noranda, you can't buy Mac and Blow, McMillan Modell. For those younger people in the room, it used to be a logging company. Because we used to say that the landmass, the trees, the jobs, the song it's who we are and we will run it. Now, like when I started politics, it was the socialists against the free enterprisers. There's no free enterprise. I vote for the free enterprisers if there was one. Now corporatization, globalization has replaced what we used to call free enterprise. When I started logging, we sold white pine in the cusp, rotten cedar for shape material in the cusp, peelers to Nelson, logs to Nelson. We sold logs to a sawmill in Salmo, logs in Brilliant, logs in Spokane City. There was a tie mill in Winlaw. There was a sawmill in there was competition. You could cut down a fir tree and sell it to this mill, cut down a white pine tree and sell it to that mill, and that's how capitalism is supposed to work. You do some work, you're supposed to get to sell it in what they call a marketplace. It's all been replaced, no matter where you live, by monopolies. One company will buy all the little, break first and then buy all the little companies within a day's hauling distance. So there's one market. You're not a businessman anymore, you're a vassal in that market. Same with Jimmy Pattison and salmon. I once had a great time. I was the Minister of Fish. I got to fight those people, but they won. Monopolies is not a healthy form of capitalism. You're bargaining your labor or your fish or your apples. Jimmy Pattison now owns the apples too. I don't care who owns it. I don't care how they vote. I don't care who they are. The thing is, in order for us in rural areas to survive, there has to be a marketplace for our labor and our product. And just like the city has replaced us politically, the corporation has replaced us in business life. Can you bring that cup of coffee up here and I wet my whistle before I get on to the good news? 15 minutes? Okay. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I want to tell you a sad story, which is good news. One time I was the Minister of Health. It's not a good job if you ever get offered. Being the Minister of Agriculture is the best honor, the best gig there is in BC. You get to travel around and actually meet real people and solve real problems and learn wonderful things. And you rarely have to sit in the legislature because there's almost always somebody in Fort St. John that wants you to come there. It's a great gig. Being the Minister of Health, all you do is you talk to hospital administrators that run hospitals that are bigger than small countries' entire GDP, or huge unions with 600,000 members. It's an institutional kind of job. And even worse, and this is not the subject of this speech, we've so misunderstood health and well-being that dying is perceived as failure. But never mind all that, isn't what I meant to say. One time, technology was changing in the medical profession, and all the hospitals wanted MRI machines. And the Premier was scared that he was losing, and so they gave me $11 million and said, go buy MRI machines and scatter them somewhere and make people happy. So we had a big meeting, and all the people in the room were saying, there's like 9 people in the executive of the Ministry of Health or something, and then there were some political fixers in room 2. So there was a whole whack of people that were talking about, where do we put these machines? And some people said, put them in really big cities because there'll be critical mass of doctors and nurses there, and the people will come to those big cities and it'll actually function. Some people said, no, it's a province with regions. Put one in Fort St. John and one in Kamloops and one in Williams Lake, and blah, blah, blah. And we go around the room like that, and finally we come, one guy's sitting there really grumpy and he doesn't say a word. And he's the Chief Medical Health Officer of British Columbia, and a person who I deeply respect, and I'm not going to tell you who he is, because I'm going to tell you what he said. And he says, I said, well, doctor, you're not saying anything, like, what's up here? And he says, I don't care where you put them. Put them all in Nelson, see if you can save your own seat, he says. And I said, well, I don't get it. Like, the doctors say that people are dying, and every day it's on TV, people are dying, and they want these machines, and if the people are dying, why didn't you tell me where to put the machines? And he said, well, because they won't do anything. I don't look after surgeries or something. I'm not in charge of that. I'm in charge of the well-being of the people of British Columbia. And those machines, they read disease, and they read trauma. We don't have disease anymore. We cured the mumps and all that other stuff that used to kill us. And we don't have trauma anymore. We're not even allowed to carry knives in the bar. And we have helmets when we ride our bikes. He said, we have so little trauma that we have to bring doctors from South Africa who actually seen trauma to teach at UBC. I said, well, it's still dying, Doc. Like, I read the papers, like, what are they dying of? And he said, they're dying of alienation. Alienation, he said, is the plague of our times. They don't know who they are. They can't remember where they came from. They don't know where they're going. They don't know who's with them. And there's a hole inside. And when there's a hole inside, it doesn't matter if you're schizophrenic or you're lost. You self-medicate. So you don't have to feel the trouble, pain. And they're self-medicated with booze and drugs and overwork and trying to make $1 million and dangerous blah blah. And then they're dying of the self-medication. That's what's killing them, or minister. And you're not going to fix it with your machine. Now, why am I telling you that story, and why did I say it's good news? It made some people in the room actually cry. I think he's right. The MRIs didn't change the well-being of British Columbians. I think that I think every one of you knows it. The wonder that is our urban economy and the wonder that is that flashing attraction that our children move to is making holes in people. And our job, I think, is to find a way to provide communities where some of those people who choose not to self-medicate or to decide to stop can find a way of life that will reconnect them with a sense of themselves and other people, socially and environmentally and economically. And they will come. And because they are the people who are not self-medicating so heavily that they can no longer think, they are the creative class that will build a future for us in spite of the monopolies. I want to close on some thoughts about how to do that. Politically, I think there is a solution, by the way. This is another bit of a side. I think there's a bit of a solution. I think there's a solution to the fact that British Columbia is ungovernable, and that would be to vote for the people who promise to regionalize land-based and community-based decision-making in British Columbia. And in spite of the fact that I've voted for the same people all of my life, and they even had to honor me by giving me a job, I don't know who's going to make that promise unless you make them. Regionalized, we have some excellent examples of regionalized decision making. I don't have enough time to give you the examples of bad decision making for us. Never mind. But like the party I don't vote for regionalized the health services. It did wonders for at least changing the debate away from death as failure and more money as success. The municipal model, the Association of Kootenai Boundary Local Municipalities and the other regions that make decisions that are 100 times more logical than the Parliament, because they're doing it in the communities where that they represent. The core model. It was the worst 4 years of my life when we made land use plans in British Columbia. People threatened to kill me from both sides, weekly. But we did it on a regional basis and we finished it. How you make a community a place where the teeming masses might wish to come is up to you. It would be as arrogant for me to tell you what to do in Lillooet as for Victoria to tell us how to live. But I have some thoughts about how you might pull it off once you decide which direction to go. First thing I want to talk about is focus. When they were trying to decide whether or not to have the Olympics in Vancouver, they got the mayor of Melbourne, Australia, who had just had the Olympics, to come and try and convince people to vote yes. You know what he said? He said, I don't care about the Olympics, really. 5 minutes? Damn. But you guys should have the Olympics because it provides what is impossible in modern life. Modern life is so complicated that decision makers can't focus. We've got more on our plate than we can manage. You have the Olympics at least for 2 years while you get ready. You will focus. The focus is the point, not the games. And my suggestion would be wherever you live, with the creative people on your council or that you know, you decide what it is you're going to do next, and you focus and you go do it. Because the celebration in the human heart when you pull something off is so big that the next step can be anything you want. Second thing is, when you're trying to talk to someone in power, the only time we listen, this is a bit of a secret, I would never tell you this if I was still running for office, but the only time, everybody wants something all the time, so the only time we listen is when it's coming out of the mouth of someone for whom it is counterintuitive. We did not expect them to say it, it's not in their vested interest. So if your town decides you want to go do something, get the person who will lose from that step as the voice. The mayor, one time I wanted to build a ferry boat on Kootenai Lake. I wanted it to be built on Kootenai Lake. I didn't want it to come from Vancouver. It's like it hadn't happened for 50 years. It was a wacko idea. Got the Minister of Transportation to Nelson, and he thought everyone in the room would want a new highway. But I knew that's what he would think, so I met with him ahead of time and got the mayor of New Denver to stand up at the meeting and say, what we all want wherever we live is a new ferry boat on Kootenai Lake, where I don't even live. The guy fell out of his chair, and we got a ferry boat. Because it was wacko in his life experience, counterintuitive. Next thing I want to say is get in your municipal council or your NGO or whatever it is, make some of the people who sit there join the political party they vote for. Because sometimes you'll need a messenger. If you're going to live in a democracy, for crying out loud, figure out where the knobs and buttons are and use them. Everybody votes for somebody. If they don't, they shouldn't be on your council. Everybody votes for somebody. Take up a collection, give them $20 and say, go join. Just so you have a messenger when you need it. Next thing I want to say is that the scariest thing to a person in power is when we find out that there's something going on that we didn't know about and can't control. That's why cabinet ministers and premiers listen to taxi drivers. Well, that's half the reason. One is that it's the only citizen they meet in their entire day. But they're trying to figure out what's going on that they don't know anything about. So whatever it is that you decide to do after you begin to focus, You make it happen first step before you tell anybody. That's political parties, all of them, they used to be what was called movements. They were powerful and they meant something. Now they're institutions. But they're afraid of movements. So you get together with those people, you decide what it is you're going to do, and then you figure out a way to let gossip be the messenger first step. So the person in power finds out, oh my God, what's going on in Kaslo? I better go. And when I get there, I'll listen. Next thing I want to say is figure out what's in your way. The biggest thing in your way. And then keep talking about it till you figure out how to make it into something good. I'll give you some examples. When I was Minister of Agriculture, rural communities everywhere, they're all annoyed about the agricultural land reserve. And everywhere I went, they we can't build subdivisions, and Walmart wants to come in here, and we can't do it, and it's a big problem, and we want to grow. The Courtney Regional District, I went to visit there one time, go to see a farmer. They put up signs that said, we're inside the agricultural land reserve, come and build your 5-acre nirvana. And what happened? My son works for WestJet. When they would fly from Edmonton to Courtney, they would go back empty because all the Albertans would stay. Because then they're alienation, that's what they were dreaming of. And now they're advertising that if you build on this 5 acres, there will never be a Walmart next door to you, and they stayed. Another example of turning bad news into good news, then cherries in Creston. For years, it wasn't worth very much because they were a little bit earlier in the state of Washington. Earlier still in Oregon, and who's ever first gets the best price. It was like that for 40 years. And then somebody figured out that maybe being latest would be where the money was, when there was no cherries in the world. So they developed a cherry that came in 3 weeks later than anybody else's, and it saved the agriculture industry of Creston. Pretty soon all the apple orchards were tipped over and everybody's growing cherries. Why? Because they figured out that if they could never be first, then being last would actually pay. Another example, Port Alberni, where all those groovy places around nearby Port Alberni. Like, they used to only get people in the summertime. And now it's a very short season, you can't really make a living, build an expensive resort just outside. They got all these storms and everybody go home. And then they said, oh, we're going to rent you a room on the sea for storm season. As if when the waves are crashing and the rain's coming down, that's a lot of fun. Just down the road, the Harriet Proctor Community Forest. We put people in prison fighting over a piece of land. Is it a watershed or a working forest? And then the local people said, well, actually, we could run it. And it became a community forest, and it makes jobs, and it makes money, and it makes people happy. Next thing I want to say, I know I'm out of time. Yeah. When we had sawmills in every village, in every town, or mines, we were proud to be from Trail or Castlegar or Nelson. And whenever our hockey team played the other guy, we went and beat them up afterwards. Because we were an entity. But it's over. If capitalism is going to go to monopolies and government's going to go to cities, then we have to kill parochialism. Collaboration is the only way to survive the changes of the times of our adulthood. Trail, Castlegar, Nelson, it doesn't matter, the towns in the Caribou, we got to learn we got to exploit what we have in common. And quit seeing the guy or the woman over the hill as different. Last piece of advice, how to pull it off, is really simple. Do not move. Urban politics is driven by image. You can buy image. You can create image. You get elected or you don't get elected according to almost what people think in the last 3 days. You make stuff happen according to power and hierarchical stuff. But politics, decision making in a rural area, we trust what our friends trust. I would go and I would talk to farmers. Oh, you know what? The biggest thing is blah blah. You got to grow some blah blah. They ain't gonna grow it until the guy across the road grows it, and then they see how he made out when he sold it and how did it go. It's like you look over the fence. When I was falling in Meadow Creek Camp, the guy came up with a kind of saw. We all used steel saws in those days. The guy came up with a saw with a weird name called Dolmar, and he's trying to. Nobody would buy it. So he gave two of the older fallers Dolmars and said, "Run these all winter, and if you like them, I'll sell them to you as used in the spring." And we all watched these old guys, and it worked pretty good, and we all bought them in the spring. Because the rural people learn by watching and by knowing and by relationship. And if you move, you lose it. And you have no power. Wherever you go, you have no influence, you have no relationship, you have no circle. And besides which, we're Canadians. We're for the underdog. And you are the underdog. And where you live is the underdog. And never abandon those folks in a jam. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so cooperation, collaboration, communication, those are three of the themes of this weekend's summit. And we didn't even tell Corky that before he wrote that speech. And he did write it. Every single word was right here, verbatim.